it's Mo and Marty. It is September 6th and I have finished 3 books so far in September. That means it's time to start another vlog style monthly reading wrap up. These are videos that I do every month and I try to talk about the books that I've read in the month as close to when I've read them as I can. I try to talk for only about 5 minutes about each book. I tell you what the book's about, whether I liked it, what I thought of it, what some of the themes were, and if I think you should read it too. Hopefully these vlogs are helpful to those who like to hear wrap-ups and who want to know what certain books are about, but they are very long. These are definitely the longest videos that I do every month. So strap in, buckle up, get a cup of something or a snack. Here we go. The first book that I finished in September was Woman at Point Zero by Nawal El-Saadawi. This book I've had for a couple of years now and I've really wanted to read it. It is translated from the Arabic by Sharif Hetata. This is like auto-fiction of the author's time in a Egyptian prison. The author of this book is a well-known feminist and women's rights advocate in Egypt. She's a scholar, she worked for the government, and when she became very outspoken, they sent her to prison. This book is kind of auto-fiction about her time, well, maybe not her time there, but someone she met there, I guess. But in the book, we see a woman, a physician a psychologist perhaps, going to the prison to talk to various prisoners. And there's one woman in the prison who won't talk to anyone, who won't do any interviews, who won't take any intervention, and she is about to be executed. And even when the prison guards and the people in the prison advocate for her to make an appeal so that she won't be executed, she doesn't listen to them and doesn't speak to them. The doctor who's going in speaking to these women becomes a little bit obsessed with this one woman who won't talk to her. But finally, on the very last day before the woman is due to be executed, the doctor is able to speak to her. And the majority of this book, the whole big middle part, is the woman's story about how she was abused by her father and uncle, and how when her parents died, she went to live with this uncle, how she was molested and sexually assaulted and raped at basically every juncture of her life, how she was taken advantage of, how she was kept uneducated, etc., etc. Her uncle does send her to school and she gets her secondary degree, which is like the highlight of her life. It follows her throughout her entire life until she reaches prison and she's telling the doctor this story. We follow the main character through all these horrible events, but we also follow her through the few moments she's had of peace and of security, of love, how that feels to her. But for the most part, this is like a sad porn, gore porn book of just every horrible thing that's ever happened to this person. But it is not, I don't think, unrealistic or intentional in that way. It does use a lot of repetition and reciting of the same passages, sometimes good, sometimes bad, about her feelings throughout life. So it flows with almost a folklorish kind of speech pattern. And despite all the horrible things in her life, we see at the end of her life that she is like at least resigned and committed to her life, and that she is thinking about it, and that is why she wanted to tell the doctor her story before she's executed. I mean, this is not an enjoyable experience to read. This is not a fun book, and I definitely read it in like 10-page increments for the most part, just because within every single one of those 10-page increments there was rape, there was abuse, there was torture. So it's not a fun or pleasant book to read, but I do think it's an interesting look at Egyptian writing and at Saadawi's experience in prison and her time as a woman in Egypt. So I think it is worth the read for sure, even though it's a very difficult read. I started this book in August for Women in Translation Month, and I'm so glad I got to it. The next book that I read in September is Universal Harvester by John Darnielle. John Darnielle is most famous for being the frontman of the Mountain Goats, which is like a weird indie sort of band. I really like the Mountain Goats. I've seen them live. I didn't know he wrote books until recently, I think, when another of his books came out. I found this book in a little free library, and I thought that this was sci-fi, and I was reading it for Sci-Fi September, but it is not sci-fi. It is more like psychological horror suspense. This follows a young man named Jeremy who lives in Iowa. He's in his early 20s. He still lives at home with his father. A few years ago, his mother passed away, and he and his father have created a peaceable bond to hold off the grief and horror that they feel at Jeremy's mother's death. Jeremy works at a local video store. This is set in the 90s, so this is a historical fiction, and he likes his very mundane, routine life. His dad often pushes him to do more, but he thinks he's pretty happy right where he is. That is until people start returning videotapes because they have some weird home videos spliced in to the movies that they're supposed to be. Jeremy and one of the Video Hut's patrons sort of look into this, tell his manager about it, and the story goes from there. This story is about Jeremy, Stephanie, his manager, and what they discover about these tapes, and the story behind the home films that are on these tapes. So the majority of the first part of this book is that, and then there's a middle section where we see some background of one of the characters, and then at the end it jumps time to 10 years later, and we see some sort of resolution to the story. I like this book. I thought it was interesting. I thought it was pretty and well written as far as a sentence by sentence basis. I enjoyed it. It was very slim, very easy to get through, but I definitely think that this will bother a lot of people because there's no full resolution to what's going on. There's no answers, and there's no truly horrific moments. There are scary parts, and there is a continuous and ongoing unsettling feeling throughout the entirety of this book, but there's never a scary monster, big bad, sure and solid thing to be afraid of. I don't usually like books like that. I don't usually like that creeping dread feeling when I know that the characters know and that you know that the characters are headed to a bad path, and that suspense, that feeling of knowing that something's bad going to happen to them, knowing that there's going to be that big monster or whatever it is that they are headed towards. I hate that feeling. But this book had more of a vibey, unsettling feeling. You didn't know if there was going to be a monster under the bed. You didn't know if there was going to be a gory murder or whatever. So you never were in that feeling of waiting for the bad thing to happen. You were just suspended in eeriness, suspended in vague horror. And that I didn't mind. I actually really enjoyed it. So I did like this book. I do think that the multiple timelines and the kind of middle section of delving into the past of the character was very disjointed, and it was hard to get into. It felt a little bit unfinished overall, but I did enjoy my time with it. The third book that I've read so far in September is South of the Border, West of the Sun by Haruki Murakami. I've never read any Murakami before, but a lot of people really, really like his work. My friend Kai likes his work, and that is who lent me this book. She lent it to me all the way back in May, and I finally did get to it. I read this book on audio. This book is only 213 pages, but reading it on audio made it go super, super fast. I read it all in one day, all in one sitting at work, and I did really enjoy it. It reminded me a lot of other Japanese books I've read and Korean books that I've read in that it is a very simple, plainly told story of one person's life from the time they were born to where the story ends, which in this case happens to be in this man's middle age. So this book follows our main character, who was born in 1951, and it's all about his life in relation to the women that have come in and out of his life. It's a little bit about his mom and being raised as an only child, but it's more about the loves that he's had in his life. It's about a young woman that he knew in grade school who he then drifted apart from in high school. It's about a girlfriend that he betrayed throughout his high school and young adult life, and then about his marriage. It has to do with his feelings about women and how those women created the man that he is today. How he treated the women, how he interacted with them has created who he is now and the person that he is today. So Murakami gets a lot of flack for being a misogynist, and I heard someone, I'll try to think of who the booktuber was, who said that he's not a misogynist, that he loves women, but he is not able to write women, that he sees them as otherworldly creatures, that he sees them as a greater species than the male human, and that his love and reverence for women is what creates the distance from women that you feel in his stories about men and women and their relationship. Having never read a Murakami, that's the only thing I really had to go on. The people who say they hate Murakami for being a misogynist, and this booktuber who said he loves women. And I think that the booktuber was right. I do think that he writes women poorly. I do think his character's relationship to the women in this book was not fleshed out on the women's side. On his side, obviously it was. But things like his greatest love, his first love in grade school, he doesn't even call her by her first name. He calls her by her surname. So there's an immediate disconnect and distance put between them as characters, put between us, the reader, and those characters. And whether that's on purpose or not, I think it does set the tone for this book being about the objectification of women. Even if you're objectifying them in a way that you love them, in a way that you revere them, in a way that you are enamored and in love with them. I also feel like this author reminds me of other male authors that I've read where it is a male fantasy, and I feel like every book will probably be like this, where it's all about his penis and sex and the pleasure that he gets from women. And even though he sometimes brings in his own faults and has realizations about the issues that he has surrounding women and surrounding life and surrounding his sexual nature, everybody's gonna have sex with him. You know, the end result is that everybody's gonna have sex with him, that he is going to bang the hot ladies, that he is going to have sex with every girl that he wants to have sex with, basically, or have sex with someone else to make up with not getting the girl who rejected him. In those respects, I can see the argument for misogyny. Now, misogyny being hating women, again, I don't think that this author hates women or that his characters hate women. I think that they love women, but I think that they objectify them and don't see them as humans and don't see them as people, which, is not great either. It's not cool. I did really like this book, the way it was written and that kind of very plain, almost staccato-like prose that I see in a lot of Asian works. Now, I'm not sure if that is because that is more the traditional storytelling design of Asian countries, specifically Japanese, but also sometimes Korean, or if that's the work of the translation. This was translated from the Japanese by Philip Gabriel, and I think Philip Gabriel is a pretty prolific translator, so I don't think it's necessarily his interjection or any of the translators' interjection. I do think that it is the manner in which Japanese books are written. The Guest Cat, which I read earlier this year, is like that. Manana Yoshimoto is like that. It's not Japanese, it's Korean. Kim Jong-un, born 1982, is like that. Although that's even more clinical. I was very trepidatious about reading a Murakami book, and I'm really glad that I got to one. I think this was a good one to start with because it was so short, because it was so easy, because it was so plain and simple. Will I be reading more Murakami? Will I be seeking out his writing? No, I don't think so. There were aspects of this, like the sex and the kind of male gaze, that I didn't love, but I liked the story as it was, and I think it was interesting and thought-provoking. So those were the first 3 books that I read in September, and when I read some more, I will let you know. It is September 11th, and I've read a bunch more books. The next book that I read in September was The Silence by Don DeLillo. I picked this book up at a little free library. I know I'm supposed to be on a book acquiring ban, and the rules of that ban are that if I haul a book, I have to unhaul a book. I did not unhaul a book for this. I just read it the next day, which is kind of neutral. It doesn't add anything to my TBR per se, but it also doesn't remove anything from my TBR, so it's kind of a loss all over. And I would say that reading this book was a loss for me as well. I cannot get these hours back. back. This is the first Don DeLillo book that I've ever read, and I don't know if I'll be reading any more of his work based on this. It has a super interesting premise. The Silence follows 4 people who are all on their way to a gathering to watch the Super Bowl. 2 of them, a couple, are flying back from Paris, and they're landing in Newark Airport in New Jersey, and then headed to Manhattan where their friends live to watch the Super Bowl with them. The other 3, I said 4 characters, there's 5 characters. The other 3 characters are already at this Super Bowl party. It is another couple who are good friends of the people coming in from Paris, and the wife of that couple's former student who is now a teacher himself. It is their tradition that these people get together and they watch the Super Bowl every year, and they are thinking their thoughts, chatting, talking, and waiting for their friends to arrive when all of a sudden the power goes out, the screen goes dead, all their phones are dead, and as the hours go by where they don't have phone service and they don't have television, they start to see that something is really, really wrong. Our couple on the plane narrowly escape death when the plane has to land at the same moments that the power outage happens. But they finally make their way to the Manhattan apartment to see their friends. And this book follows all these people and their thoughts about what is happening, what is possibly happening. There's no information, what they should be doing, what they think they should be doing, what they are doing. But it is told in a very, talk about staccato manner, where people are talking to each other, but they're not listening to each other. People are making speeches, but they're not taking into account the other people that are involved. And it definitely, I think, is commentary on how people are not connected and how they think they're connected through their phones, they think they're connected through technology, but actually they're just kind of screaming into the void, and then when technology disappears, they're even more so screaming into the void and they're not able to connect in any kind of real way. This book is very short. It's only like 115 pages, but it's written in like typewriter font, which was super annoying. I think that every single person in this book was like irritating. I don't know if that was intentional or if it was just the writing of the book. It was very selfish, and people's attitudes and commentary was very selfish. I do think that that was kind of the point of the book, that everyone is like in their own bubble and not paying attention to each other. But here we have this opportunity to care for each other, to take care of each other, to respect each other and check in with each other, and all of these 5 people don't take it, to the point where like husbands leave their wives and friends kind of backbite each other. It wasn't a nice book. It wasn't a pleasant book. It wasn't a pleasant reading experience. It had some interesting ideas, and one of the reasons I think that this book was kind of controversial was that it was written right before the pandemic started in 2020. I don't know if it came out at that time or if it came out a little bit further into 2020 than the pandemic, but it definitely echoed some of the ideas and feelings of the pandemic. The loss of communication, the loss of connection with people. It definitely echoed the insecurity and unsureness of not knowing what's going on, not knowing what information there is available, or if that information is accurate day to day, minute to minute. And I think it did also echo some of the later repercussions of the pandemic, where people should have been coming together, people should have been taking care of each other, and instead it created more of a rift in the after ripples of this global event. The Silence takes place in 2022 and revolves around the Super Bowl of 2022. So although it was written in 2020, it is kind of predicting a future event, which I think is another reason that this book was like fascinating to people, but also probably not well received by people. Overall, I didn't like it. I didn't like it. The next book that I read in September was Marcel Duchamp, The Afternoon Interviews by Calvin Tompkins. This is just what it says on the tin. It is several short interviews with Marcel Duchamp. It has a really interesting introduction by Paul Chan, where he is doing an interview with Calvin Tompkins and kind of touches on Calvin Tompkins' relationship to Duchamp, the artist, and also Tompkins' background and his connection with art. I tabbed quite a bit of this book. There was a lot of interesting things that Marcel Duchamp said. There was a lot of interesting ideas about art. There was a lot of interesting historical tidbits in these interviews, and I was really excited to read it. I'm super glad that I did. I think it was excellent. If you know Duchamp's art at all, I think that helps with this book, but I think overall it could be read as a standalone with no knowledge of art and looked at as sort of a artist's philosophy condensed into these 3 little interviews. It's definitely not all encompassing. It definitely doesn't explain who Marcel Duchamp is. It definitely doesn't explain art movements throughout history, but it does talk about them. So if you have some familiarity with especially like 20th century artists and art movements, then you will have a basic idea of what's happening here. I think it would definitely help when reading this book to have that pre-knowledge, but I don't think it's strictly necessary to have it. If you like reading articles, if you like the idea of philosophies, if you like to see how different people work in their careers and in their trades, then this would be an interesting one to read, even if you don't know that much about art. If you do know about Marcel Duchamp, if you do love him, if you do know art, if you do love the movements that his art kind of meandered through and around, like Cubism, abstract expressionism, surrealism, Dadaism, and pop art, then this book is even more meaningful and even more interesting. Marcel Duchamp was a very interesting character by this account, and he had a lot of interesting philosophical, artistic ideas and philosophical ideas about work and labor and how art is created and what art means to the artist and what art means to the viewer. So again, super short book, under 100 pages, super easy to read. Loved it. The next book that I finished in September was Foster by Claire Keegan. This is another very short book, under 100 pages, by the Irish author Claire Keegan, who got a lot of acclaim for her not latest novel. I think she has another novel coming out soon, but her last novel, which was Small Things Like These, which was shortlisted for the Booker, I believe. Possibly also the Women's Prize. I can't remember. Foster is about a young girl who comes from a family who is overrun by children. Her mother is pregnant again, only several months after giving birth to the last child, and it is a time when it's extremely difficult for the mother to deal with all these children. So she sends her oldest daughter to live with her sister and her sister's husband in another part of Ireland. Our young main character, who actually I don't know if she is named or not, goes to live with her aunt and uncle, and as she's settling into that environment, we kind of learn more about her family and how her father is an alcoholic and how her father gambles, how her father mistreats her mother and the children, and keeps the main character of this book's mother like perpetually pregnant, even though they don't have the means to support all these children. We also learn about the main character's aunt and uncle and the kind of people they are. This book just takes place over one short summer that our main character stays with her aunt and uncle. I really like this book. It's really beautifully written. It is like lyrical without being purple prose or over the top. It has like a touch of like kind of nature writing in the descriptions of the landscape and the farm where the Foster is staying. It's very sentimental, very sweet. I didn't tear up, but I got like a welling, like a welling of tears for sections of this book. And in a very short time, we are introduced to our main character and her predicament, as well as the aunts and uncles' lives, as well as a little bit into the culture of rural Ireland. So there are some scenes at a funeral which are kind of interesting and enlightening. It's not clear when this book takes place, but it seems like it probably takes place, in the early 20th century or mid 20th century, but not under a time of like extreme duress in Ireland. And it could be modern day for all I know. The adults involved are all farmers, so maybe that is now. I'm not sure when it's set it's unclear. I really enjoyed this book. I'm glad that I read it. I know that Brian from Bookish really likes this book, and a lot of people obviously really liked her other work. I love that this book is super short, easy to read, but I did have a issue with this book. Well, okay, so I did have an issue with this book, but it's not an issue with this book. This book was totally fine and did nothing wrong, but I'm having an issue that a lot of the things that I read, a lot of the things that I watch, a lot of the media that I consume is so horribly negative, has so much abuse and rape and disturbing elements and torture and death and inhumane actions, animal violence, you know, all those things that a lot of the media that I consume end up having that as like a twist or as a significant part of the story, as the main catalyst for the story, that every story I read now, and I'm not talking about like horror books that are specifically about torture or violence or death. I'm talking about literally everything that I consume. A straightforward, simple book about two women, like The Door, you know, and an obsessive behavior becomes a vehicle for cat death, animal violence, and someone poisoning animals. Like, there's so many horrific things in every piece of media that I consume, pretty much, that's what I expect. I expect every story to have rape. I expect every story to have violence against women. I expect every story to have animal torture. And it's really like messing with my enjoyment of things, because I always have this like dread. I always have this fear, and I always have this expectation of like what horrible thing is going to happen. So while reading this book, although it does deal with abuse in a very nebulous, not fully discussed way, where it does deal with violence towards women indirectly, where it does have to do with farm life, and so there probably is some like animal violence. It doesn't ever go to a super crazy dark place. It has dark elements, but the whole time that I was reading it, I was waiting for this child to get abused. I was waiting for her to get beaten. I was waiting for her to get raped. I was waiting for someone in her life to turn out to be more of a destructive force than her parents are. Although they are discussed to be a destructive force, and although it is stated that she, or implied that she gets disciplined at home, it's not the kind of horror, torture, sexual violence that I was expecting, you know, that I'm always constantly wary of, that I'm always worried about, that I'm always anticipating. And I don't know, that's such a disservice to my reading experience and my life experience, that behind every corner, behind every story, there must be some horrible thing. There must be some abuse and destruction and inhumane action. I worry that our world has created that, and that the lack of humanity of our human society, and the lack of humane treatment of people, and the overlooking of violence against women, or violence against people of color, or violence against trans people, or people in the LGBT plus community, has scarred me for life. And I don't know if I can come back from that. I don't want every story to be happy. I don't want every story to be unnuanced and fluffy, but maybe if we read more happy stories, we wouldn't worry about a little bit of a nuanced story, or we wouldn't have as much violence in our world as we do. That discussion was brought up by my reading of Foster, but doesn't actually really have anything to do with Foster. The next book that I read in September was Why the Woman is Singing on the Corner by Dolores Kendrick. The byline of this book says, a verse narrative. This book is written in verse. It's very, very short. I think it's just over 100 pages, maybe just under 100 pages, and even then there are some extremely sparse pages and verse in this story. Basically, this story is about a woman who lives in DC. She's getting older, she's getting near to her 50s, and her sister is much older than her. And through our main character's kind of thoughts, our main character's name is Ophelia, but they call her Phelia. Through her thoughts, and some dialogue, and some action, and some plot, we find out about Phelia's life and her relationship to her sister, her relationship to her parents, her relationship to the 3 men that she has loved throughout her life. We learn about her sister's eventual death and how that affects Ophelia, and kind of how Ophelia, even though she is not a old woman, has been like burdened throughout her life with tragedy and death and abuse and neglect and all sorts of horrible things that women face every day, all the time, especially women of color. We kind of see Ophelia's descent into, I don't want to say madness, because madness is not exactly the right word, but since the Ophelia references is there, I think we can go with madness, and how she kind of becomes untethered and unattached to the rational world and ends up being a woman singing on the corner. I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was really interesting, super quick to read. There were definitely probably a lot of literary or poetic references that I didn't catch. Ophelia and Ophelia being a super easy one, I did catch that obvious connection of the main character Ophelia in this book and Ophelia from Hamlet being neglected and abused by men in her life, and how that led her to eventual madness and eventual, in Hamlet's Ophelia's case, death. But I'm sure there were other things in this book that I didn't quite get. Apparently Dolores Kendrick is a poet laureate of Washington, D.C. and has written many works of poetry and some other works of fiction. This was a very short, quick, easy to read book, as most novels in verse are. Because it is so poetic, even more than some of the other novels in verse that I have read, it does take some getting used to and some concentration to get immersed in, but because it's so short, you can read it all in just an hour or two, and so therefore it's easy to get immersed into. I would definitely highly recommend it if you're interested. And those are six more books that I've read in September, and when I read some more, you know. It is September 22nd, and I have finished 3 more books in September. I finished Exit Strategy, which is the 4th book in the Murderbot series. This is our fourth installment, and it picks up right after the 3rd book. So if you're unfamiliar with the Murderbot series, this series follows our self-named narrator, Murderbot, who was a security robot who also had human parts and is sentient. Murderbot has hacked its own governing chip, so it doesn't really work for the corporation that controls it, because now it's under its own control. Murderbot has decided all they really want to do is watch soap operas and hang out. They will fulfill their job as much as they need to, but their heart really isn't in it since they have taken over their own free will. But Murderbot gets wrapped up in helping the humans that it's assigned to in the 1st book, and discovers that while it has free will, they still enjoy helping humans. The first 4 short novellas follow Murderbot as they're realizing who they are, as they're understanding what they like and what they don't like, what they want and what they don't want. The kind of overarching mission for them is to figure out why, before they hacked their governing chip, part of their memory was dismantled by the corporation that had owned them. So now that they are a free sentient being, they decide to embark on various adventures, meeting lots of different people, other AI, and ships along the way to figure out a way to find their memories. The 4th book kind of finishes part of that larger story arc, and it kind of finishes a mini story arc that we pick up in the 1st book. The 5th book is a short novel, not a novella, so it's like 250 pages, and I wonder if that book is going to kind of wrap up the bigger first storyline. I liked the 4th installment, but not as much as the 3rd installment, I don't think. I think these first 4 novellas are fairly formulaic, where we see Murderbot, we talk about where we are in the story, Murderbot decides that they're going to do something, and then they end up having to help humans along the way, and they discover that they don't mind helping humans that much. The first 4 books follow that trajectory, and then I think in the 5th book we're going to see like a lot more resolution of things going on, and a little bit more of breaking away from that kind of repetitious story arc. I hope. I don't know. I do enjoy these books. They're not like my favorite ever. I don't think they're amazing. I don't remember all the details, partly because they're formulaic. It's hard to remember everything that happens in each book. They kind of blur together, but I do think it's important to read them kind of in quick succession, because the month-long gap that I took between reading the third book and the fourth book, I really had forgotten a lot of what was going on. The novellas do a good job of filling you in on what's going on, but I think reading them closer together enhances your experience. The next book that I finished in September was Minotaur by Benjamin Thomas. This is what I would consider a forgotten modern classic. It was written earlier than 1989, but it was published in 1989, which is the year that the author died. The author is of Russian descent, but lived in Israel and was an Israeli writer for most of his life. He has numerous novels, and I think this one, being published close to his death, was kind of his forgotten novel. This novel takes place in 4 parts. In the first part, we learn about a secret agent who becomes completely infatuated with a girl that he sees on the bus, and he realizes that this is the woman that he's dreamed of his whole life, that this is his destiny. Unfortunately, as he says, it's a cruel twist of fate that they are the wrong age. He's in his 40s and she is a teenage girl. He knows that he can't meet her and nothing can come of it, but he starts writing letters to her and expressing all the love and admiration that he's felt for her over the years, when she was just like a vision in his mind. So that first part, we follow those letters and their relationship through those letters. The second part, we follow another person who comes in and out of this young woman's life. The third part, we follow another person who comes in and out of this young woman's life. And then the fourth part, we see again the secret agent with more detail to his background, his life, and how he came to envision this young girl and become enamored of her. I thought it was really interesting. I read it over quite a few days, and I think it would have benefited me to read it all together, but I loved that it was self-referential, and I loved that all the pieces of these 4 different stories came together and we saw them from all different angles. So we met the characters from the later sections in the first section, but we didn't know what the significance to the secret agent is. We didn't know what the significance to the young woman they were necessarily, and we didn't see those private behind-the-scenes interactions between people. So then you get the next section and you learn more of it, and you get the next section and you learn more of it. And it was just really interesting and good, but I think that because there was a lot of repetition to the stories, reading it kind of piecemeal, it was easy to see the repetition, whereas I think if you read it all the way through in 1 or 2 sittings, you would have been a little bit more engrossed in the story and not taken out of it by that mirroring of experiences. It was interesting because it does have a secret agent element, it does have some thrilling moments, it does have some love stories, also some like heartbreak and the feeling of being removed from the one that you love, and it was told in that manner, especially in the first section when the person who is in love with the young girl can't fully communicate with her, can only communicate with her through letters. I've never heard anyone else talk about this book, but one of the weird things is that Universal Harvester, which I read earlier this month, actually has a quote from this book in the very beginning. I was already planning to read Minotaur when I started reading this, and I was shocked to see that they were connected. I would definitely read more Benjamin Thomas. If you've read Minotaur, definitely let me know, because I would love to dissect it with someone. The next book that I've read so far in September is The Road from Karain, and this is by Jill Kerr Conway. It is a memoir of Conway's time growing up in Australia. Her father was a World War I veteran, and when he married his mother, he was able to take advantage of the Australian benefit of being given a large piece of farmland out in the Australian plainland, out in the Australian bush. Jill's parents were completely in love, and despite the hardships, they made the best of living in an extremely hard landscape, a hostile environment, of drought, of having children and being isolated, having no one to talk to, having medical facilities hundreds of miles away that it was very difficult to get to. The first several years that they were there, they didn't have a telephone or any means of communicating with people, even the ones close to them, except by traveling to them. So this is Conway's Conway's experience as she grew up. It talks about her parents and their love story and their hardships. It talks about her brothers, and it talks about this extremely isolated lifestyle that they all had and how they were raised to think that that was normal. This book is very much about Conway's experience with education, how when she was growing up, her brothers initially had like a governess who taught them, and then later when they went away to boarding school, she had already learned so much from listening to their studies that she began like a correspondence school. How when eventually her mother and her were forced to move to Sydney, how her education molded her and both gave her enlightenment into certain aspects, but because of the education that was chosen for her, or that she chose, that it cut her off from certain understandings for a long time as well. And this book follows her right up until her postgraduate work, when she becomes a scholar and an intellectual herself and pursues further education. This book talks a lot about the relationship between herself and her mother, and it's very much about how that isolation that they faced on Karain, their farm out in the Australian plains, formed that relationship, and the tragedies and joys that they went through in their life formed that relationship, and how that relationship impacted Conway for her entire life. I really like this one. I read this for the TBR spin and also for Stray September. My mother gave me this book. She wanted me to read it. She had read it before. It reminded me a lot of Out of Africa, in that the farms from these two stories were very similar, and those feelings of isolation and having to understand a set of social mores and morals that in Conway's part she grew up with, and then had to understand the opposite, the city ideas and ideals. And in Isak Denison's experience went the opposite way, where she went from being a person who was used to cities and towns and community to someone who went to a remote farm. All the tragedies and hardships of farming were very similar, and they both had very different but very beautiful writing styles. A lot of Conway's writing, especially about Karain, was almost like nature writing, which was really nice. And then her description of the cities and those experiences were beautiful as well. So if you're interested in reading a memoir about an influential Australian, although I don't think Conway was a super influential Australian as far as influential Australians go, it's interesting to see how much she thought about Australia and the social structure there and the history of Australia at a time when Australian history was still very much determined by colonialism. So it's interesting to see the colonial ideas and how much they hang on even past the time when a country is under colonization. I would love to learn more about Australian history in this kind of way. Like, I would love to learn more about people who lived in Australia and their experiences. Conway in this book talks about Australian history and how there's very many different experiences in Australia. So it makes you really inspired to learn about those differences and those similarities of Australian people. Those were 3 more books that I read in September, and when I read some more, I will let you know. It is October 2nd, and that means it's time to wrap up the last books that I read in September and do my wrap up of this reading wrap up. So the next book that I read was What Belongs to You by Garth Greenwell. This is a literary, I guess it's just a literary novel about a young man who moves to Bulgaria, there it is, I couldn't think of it, to teach English there. He speaks the language, but not super well, and he's kind of trying to escape his life in the States to some degree, but mostly he just wants a change of pace. The book starts with him cruising in the bathrooms of a national park type area and meeting a young man for sex there, who he quickly becomes enamored of and returns to often for sex, and then starts a more vague relationship with when he invites him home. So our main character and this sex worker start like a vague relationship. Partly it's vague because their relationship is not defined. Obviously, they're in a transactional relationship, but also because they don't speak the same language, sometimes the nuances of how they refer to each other and what they say to each other is lost on the American teacher. This book follows how that relationship changes over time. It also delves into the past of the main character and his relationship with his father, his relationship with mother, his time growing up, his relationship with his stepsisters, and how that kind of refers back to the relationship with the sex worker and how he in some ways loves this man and in some ways hates this man. There are some like thrilling moments, some like disturbing moments. There's a little bit of sex, not as much as you would think. It's definitely not explicit or graphic. I enjoyed this one. I think it's a very like slow, semi-plotless book. It's really just revolving about this relationship. It's really just about these two men and how their lives are vastly different and how in some ways they're similar as well. It talks a little bit about like abusive relationships and transactional relationships. It talks a little bit about sexually transmitted diseases and has trigger warnings for like death of a parent. I mean, lots of trigger warnings you should probably check if you're worried about it. It almost verges on being a thriller because it does have some like tense moments where you're not sure what's going to happen, where you're not sure where the book is leading, but it never is a thriller, really. There's never a mystery or adventure that needs to be had or solved for this book. It's really just a study of this relationship. I did really enjoy it, and I would be interested to read more of Garth Greenwell. I think it did drag a little in like the middle section. My interest was held more by the relationship between the two men, and then when we kind of get to our main character's backstory and his childhood and why he kind of left America, as well as his relationship with his parents, I wasn't as interested. And this book definitely has like solid blocks of text. There's no speech marks for the most part. There is dialogue, but the dialogue happens within these huge blocks of pure text. So it looks like a very intimidating book, but it isn't really. It's definitely not hard to read, and you get through the pages very quickly. I read this in like 3 days. The next book that I read in September was Murder at Hotel 1911. This was on my end of the year pile of possibilities, or TBR. This is one of the books that was hanging out on my 2022 RAB spreadsheet, and I'm glad that I read it. I actually bought this book like on Amazon, I think, because I had heard that there was like mental health rep in it, and it takes place in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is a location that I visited with my husband. So I thought it would be a cool book to read and have some interesting location to it, which it didn't really. This book follows Ivy Nichols, who is a 28-year-old woman still living at home with her dad. She has severe anxiety and panic attacks, which she is recovering from, but since she has not fully recovered from them, since she dropped out of college because of them, and since her mother disappeared when she was young, which helps to spur these on, she has decided to continue living with her dad. The problem with that is that she does long for independence, and she's also started working at her mother's family estate, which was recently turned into a super fancy hotel, the Hotel 1911. One of the issues with working there is that she's been lying to her father about working there because her father doesn't want her looking into the disappearance of her mother, and he doesn't want her going anywhere near anything that could potentially trigger her anxiety. Ivy Nichols, of course, is working at this hotel when a death occurs. Probably not a natural death, probably foul play, and she gets wrapped up in it. I really struggled with this book. It's definitely like a very typical cozy mystery. You have kind of a bumbling, awkward main character. You have, right off the bat, a couple of potential love interests. Our main character has relationships with people who have been going on for a long time, like her father and her best friend, who also works at the hotel. And then you have these new relationships that she's forming at this new workplace. So the manager of the hotel, who knows a lot more about the family and is someone that Ivy really wants to talk to about her family that she knows nothing about, other coworkers, etc. But this one was just so annoying. Like, there was just so many aspects of this cozy mystery that I was like, this is completely unbelievable. It's completely ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. She like bikes everywhere, but there's still like no description of the city. And I think that was one of the things that I was looking for and was disappointed that wasn't there. It just had like an irksome narration to it as well. I didn't particularly like Ivy. And now listen, I don't have to like every cozy mystery main character because they're usually really annoying, but there's usually something that keeps you engaged with them, and her personality just really wasn't doing it for me. I don't know if the anxiety rep was well written, but I have the feeling that it wasn't. I do think its own voices, and I do think the author suffers from anxiety, but the way that Ivy kind of tackled everything on her own, left her therapist, didn't tell her dad, lied to everyone, stopped taking her medication, like, it just didn't feel like good advice. It didn't feel like a good representation of what people actually do when they have extreme anxiety, or what you should do when you have extreme anxiety. I knew I was going to finish this book because it is quite short. It's just a little over 100 at 275 pages, but I was almost completely sure that I wasn't going to continue on with the series, except that this book ends on a cliffhanger, which I do want to know the answer to. I think the most interesting thing about this book was the house itself and the story of how Ivy's relatives lost the house, how she didn't know her relatives, her mother's relationship with the relatives, not even her mother's disappearance so much, but like the family history that Ivy is trying to look into to explain her mother's disappearance. So that part was pretty engaging. I think the descriptions of the hotel were pretty engaging, and right at the end we find something out about the hotel that made me really want to continue on with this series. I think the only way that I would get the next book, so far this is only a duology, is to buy it at a used book sale or a bookstore or used online, and I will not be doing that anytime soon. If I see it in a used bookstore, I will definitely pick it up, or maybe next year I will potentially buy it used online just to get it over with. The next book that I read in September was James McBride, 5 Carat Soul. This is a collection of short stories by James McBride, whose most recent book I think was the Heaven and Earth grocery store or something like that. He's a pretty acclaimed Black American author who I think was maybe shortlisted for the National Book Prize at one point. I picked this book up because my friend was interested in reading James McBride, so I picked this one up for him at a used book sale, but I decided that I would read it before I gave it to him. The short stories are varied. Some of them are one-off short stories. I really, really like the first short story, which is about a vintage toy collector slash seller who gets the lead on this one-of-one, really sought-after collectible, and his story of how he finds it and the people involved in it and who those people are, and how his search for this crazy expensive toy leads him on a much different journey than he expected. The next short stories are actually like 3 or 4 short stories collected about the same family and the same young man, and then there's a bunch of one-offs, and then at the very end there's a collection of short stories about animals at a zoo. So it was interesting to read it, especially on audio, because the stories were all told by different narrators. So the first story was a standalone that was told by one person. The second collection of short stories about the young man were all told by the same person. The next collection of one-offs were told by the same person, and the last collection was told by yet another narrator, which I really enjoyed. I don't usually read short story collections on audio because for me, I can't read short story collections all together. I have to break them up. I read this throughout the month of September so that I could read a short story, stop, read something else, read a short story, stop, read something else. And I don't usually read them on audio because it's difficult to know where one story ends and the next begins, especially if you don't have the physical copy of the book. But because they were all different narrators, it was easy to distinguish where the stories started and stopped. And then I also had the physical copy, so I was able to kind of read along with it if I wanted to, or mark it where I had read it. Like any collection of short stories, there were some of the short stories that I really enjoyed in this, and some that I didn't like quite as much. There was a couple that I was like confused over. Maybe if I'd read them physically, I would have had a better understanding of them. So I'm excited for my friend to read this, and we can discuss it, and maybe he can clue me in on some of the things that I missed. It did make me want to read more of James McBride. The last book that I finished in September was Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham. This is a classic sci-fi novel written in 1948. It is the second John Wyndham book I've read. Day of the Triffids starts with a middle-aged man in a hospital. His eyes are bandaged, and we come to find out that this is because he works with the Triffids, which are these weird plant creatures that have come into recent history. They have amazing properties, amazing oils, nutrients that people have recognized, and in the last several years have become a boon to the economy all over the world. So Triffid farms have popped up. They're farming Triffids. They're doing all sorts of things with Triffids. But because Triffids are spread by seeds blowing around, there's Triffids everywhere now. And something that was quickly realized about the Triffids, but that was unexpected, was that they are poisonous and that they have a sting which sometimes lashes out, and if the sting touches you, you are poisoned and you will probably die. Our main character did encounter a sting in his childhood that almost killed him, but because the plant was very young, the poison wasn't very potent and he was able to survive that. He went on to become a biologist and work in a Triffid plantation. Unfortunately, his friend who also worked there was killed when there was a Triffid incident, and our main character, Bill, was blinded by getting just like a drop of Triffid poison in his eye. As he's in the hospital, another weird event happens where all these green comets are falling out of the sky. No one knows why they're doing this. No one knows what they are, but they are dazzled by the experience. Everyone all around the world is watching these amazing green comets. Bill's nurse is describing it to him as he lays blinded in the hospital. When Bill wakes up the next day to seemingly no one in the hospital, he takes it upon himself to uncover his eyes and find out what's going on. That's the basic premise of this book. That's really all you need to know about Day of the Triffids, I think, going into it, and then you just hang on for the ride. John Wyndham's writing is so engaging. It's very plain and simple. It's not super lyrical or poetic or descriptive even, but it carries you throughout the story and you want to know what happens. I think he's also very good at character development and creating characters that you feel close to within a short amount of time. I actually started this one on audio because I needed an audiobook, but then I finished it physically, so I read about half and half. This is the second John Wyndham book I've read, and just like the first one I read, The Chrysalis, this book has a lot of tropes and things in it that are very commonplace now. A lot of the horror elements, a lot of the scientific elements are things that we've seen a million times, but were new when this was first written. So it's definitely a predecessor to a lot of the horror that we see today. But because of that, it sometimes feels like redundant, or like you've seen it before, or it's been done before, and maybe to better extent because they've had many years to perfect it. Also, very much like The Chrysalids, it does push a social and political opinion, some of which you can mold to what your own opinions are, and some of which are pretty obvious, I think. But although these political and social ideas are not subtly stated, I think that they don't detract from just the fun sci-fi horror of the book. I really love John Wyndham. I can't wait to read more. I think I have 2 more of his books. I really want to get to it. I still think I like The Chrysalids more. It could be because it was the first book by John Wyndham I read, but I did find parts of Day of the Triffids a little bit unsatisfying. There were some connections between the Triffids, the comets, and the plague that were never fully explained, but some of the explanations, some of the potential explanations that were given weren't really my favorite. Like, I wish things had been a little bit more tightly connected and explained to the reader in like a revelation or like in a reveal. But I did love it, and I highly recommend. So those were the 14 books that I read in what month? September. I read so many different things. I read like a booktube darling. I read some nonfiction. I read some translated work. I read my first Murakami. I read a Australian memoir. I read some modern classics. I read a novel in verse. I read a collection of short stories. I read works by authors of color. I continued on in a few series. I read my first John Darnell. I read my first Don DeLillo. I read one of the books off of my end of year TBR. I read for Stray September. Look out for my Readathon Recap, which will be coming after this video, recapping all the readathons that I read for in September, including this one. I read some books that I didn't love, but that's okay. I think I had a good balance of queer work, works by people of color, my favorite genres. So let me know if you've read any of the books that I read here. Let me know what you thought of them. Let me know how your reading month in September went. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!